Okay, good afternoon, everyone. We will just wait for another 4 minutes and see for the others to join, and then we will start. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. A very warm welcome in Genesis Global School Visual Arts webinar, Visual Art Development Beyond Curriculum. Myself, Doipan Chakraborty. You can call me DC because I know my name is little critical. Visual Art Teachers, Genesis Global School, and I am the moderator for today's event. During the event, you can post your response in the chat, or you can raise your hand to speak using the hand icon. Okay. Now I have immense pleasure to introduce you with our session leader today, Mr. Haninder Sharma, whose life has been associated with the world of education for many years now. With good experience in variety of both national and international curricula, Mr. Haninder is one of the true believer and promoters of IB education, considering it an excellent curriculum, providing students with the education required for having a bright future. As a lifelong learner, he has always been using any opportunity for his own learning and has been transferring his knowledge to other colleagues, believing that learning happens in collaboration and a continuous sharing of perspective and practices, for which we are here now. So over to you, Mr. Haninder. Welcome you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope I am audible to everyone. If yes, please confirm.
Yes, sir.
Now, as Mr. DC pointed out, I think this will be a much more fruitful session if it plays out as a conversation between us. Because frankly, I think that there is a lot of value in collective wisdom, and we are going to try and tap into some of that. And this session's objective will be that we are going to try and inquire together about how visual art, the skills we acquire, the understanding we acquire as a MYP student, or a student, the skills that a student acquires, and the skills and understanding that we acquire as IB facilitators, how are that
How are
connected
that
and
connected and
useful in
useful?
real life scenarios. Now, as we all very much are aware about the drastic times we are going through, and we already were saying that the times are changing so fast that it's very difficult to keep track of what should be the ideals of education. And especially in the times now where the things have become even more intense, I think it will be useful for all of us to sit and discuss and collaborate on what should be the learning objectives in our classrooms these days, and how will they might help in students' personal context, regardless of whether they want to take up art as a profession or not. And so for that, I think, and since we are doing a discussion about visual arts beyond curriculum, so we would like to start our conversation about real life rather than the curriculum. So for the next slide, it's an engagement basically where I will take down the keywords from your answers, and you will try and answer the first question in what you think are the most crucial skills in today's context for the students in general, whether they are related to art or not, but what are the general skills that a student should inculcate in themselves to prepare themselves better for future. So you can answer now. And DC sir, if there's a hand raised, you can call out the names.
Sure,
Or if
sure, sure, sir.
anyone, would anyone like to speak?
Yes, sir. I can see that in the chat, Ms. Bhagyajyoti Nayak has responded that learners need to be critical thinkers as well as creative. The responses are coming in the chat, sir. I'm just
Yes,
directing them.
I think that's a very valid response, because I think the present time has proven that even scientists and political leaders must also think creatively, because the situations can be very.
Critical thinking is a kind of response that is coming from a lot of the participants. And there is another one from Miss Gracie. It's different perspectives.
I think that's also one of the most crucial skills, which I personally believe that being able to understand perspectives in today's time where things are so partisan, that we are practically thinking of people who do not share the same thoughts as us as aliens. So something that we have nothing common between. And I think IBDP, no, IB Visual Arts does a fabulous job in providing enough opportunities to inculcate this kind of ability to navigate multiple perspectives, which we will discuss in the later slides. Any other question? Any other
Yes,
response?
Miss Subida is responding. Critical thinkers is there, and innovative, risk takers, and balanced.
Risk takers. So another IB official term for this is now courageous. Sir, you dropped 2-3 different terms.
Yes, balanced is one.
Risk taker, balanced, and yes, and I think these are self-evident why these are so important in our lives as well as students' life.
Yes, Mr. Prakash is responding open mind.
See, we already see a lot of learner profiles coming in. And I think this idea of understanding different perspectives and being open-minded is very closely related, which we will also go into the later slides. And please mind my spellings. I'm a little wobbly with my written word. Any other inputs, sir?
No, sir. No, sir.
Okay. So now, since we
Okay,
have,
there is another one called it's digital knowledge. I think this is quite interesting.
yes, yes, quite relevant. Now for the rest of the session, we are going to stress again and again on these skills and see how what we already do in classroom already is catering to these skills, and where else we can open more opportunities for students to acquire these abilities and these skills. Now, for that, I think it will be very fruitful if everyone gives their ideas and their thoughts, so that we have multiple perspectives to build a more comprehensive understanding of the activities we do in our own classrooms. So, and I'm actually looking forward to a lot of input from you as well, because as a teacher, I think especially as an IB teacher, it's so flexible that more you perspectives you know, the better you are equipped in your planning and in your delivery of the curriculum. So here I would like to see if anyone can make connection between any of these aims, visual art aims, and the skills we discussed in the previous slide through any activity we do in the class. For example, for the first one, I think the most obvious one is process journal. So that is something that we do in class that goes with the lifelong engagement also, and it goes with critical thinking and creative thinking as well. Because ideally, the process journal should have a very objective view of one's explorations. I think I spelled critical wrong. So, is there any thing that you can relate to, for example, the second aim that you do in the class regularly? This is, sir, do we have any inputs in the chat?
So I think it's still typing. Once received,
Okay.
I'll type it towards you.
So the idea of discussing this is, I'm sure that we all do a lot of activities but sometimes our perspective is that of teaching art and inculcating visual art skills. But I think the thinking small thought experiments like this help us build richer and more complex connections between the concepts we are delivering and the actions we are conducting in the classroom.
So Miss Gracie is responding that we use illustrations as reflection.
Using illustration as expression would
Reflections.
call illustrations as reflections.
Yes. And Miss Bhagya Jyoti is responding, we help learners to bring their creativity outcome out very authentically.
So I would say using illustration as reflection can fit to express ideas with confidence and competence.
Yeah.
Sir, what was the second one?
Help learners to bring their creativity come out very authentically.
Creativity coming out very authentically. I think the word authentic points guides me here.
Yes. Yes. Personal and cultural context, right?
So if there's anyone who want to directly address one of the aims, can definitely do so.
You can unmute your microphone and just give the response.
Yes, you can, and you can just speak as well, because I think we are not that big a group that should be a problem at any point. So if there is anything not to be added to this, he can move on to the next slide, where we're going to discuss the same connections between the activities we are doing in the class with the aims and objective, and how that relate to different parts of the curriculum outside visual arts. So I'm sure that a lot of us have put a lot of thought behind planning and integrating the ATL skills and mapping the ATL skills on our unit plans very carefully, and one has to really put down a lot of thoughts. So for that, I think I personally had a lot of problem with this, because sometimes I would think that the same activity is connected to all the different skills, and so many cover so many strands within the same skill. So how to choose a particular strand for a particular activity? Now for that, I think this is what I try and do in my mind. I try and make a mental matrix of how everything is interconnected, which is usually true for all the things in IBDP, on IB visual arts, whether MYP or DP. So, for example, there is a very complicated way in which assessment objectives are connected with the components that we teach. Everything overlaps, and so I think these maps kind of help me build a story, and I then go with the story rather than with the concepts that, okay, I'll take this skill with this learner profile. So if it works as a story in a line, and it nicely correlates with the activity we are doing and the discussions we are having in the class, I think that's when the things happen in the most harmonized way. For example, I just sat down and I kind of made a very first impression map of these things, these different list of attributes and skill sets and aims, and try to just by the very first impression connect them, and it became such a good illustration for me to show the nature of MYP or IBDP planning in visual arts, or I think other subjects as well. So instead, now I'm not very anxious about what connection, what all, how do I leave out certain connections, how do I pick one against another. If it falls into the story that I'm building with my student over the years, for example, they start with grade 6 and grade 7. So through vertical planning, we know what their journey is like and where exactly are they in their journey, as from starting as an artist to being able to put out and curate a show, produce and curate a show. So in that context, this becomes very helpful, and saves me has saved me a lot of stress about making decisions and being doubtful about them. So for example, if anyone follows any of these lines, understand the dynamic nature of arts, and it goes to reflective and also goes to thinker. So when we consider, okay, at which point can we say that we do something in the class that causes the student to understand the dynamic nature of arts, and that would be things like going into historical origins of artistic styles or depiction of a particular motif through time. So we all do these exercises in our classrooms, and these are very good opportunity for us to drive home the point that this is how if you manage your thoughts, you think in a structured way, and then that further can go here.
So it will connect with the critical thinking also.
Yes.
Critical thinking, creative thinking, all of them are somehow connected.
And this was, I think, one of the most important and most often cited input, if I'm not wrong. Critical
Yes,
thinking.
yes,
So
yes.
let's do this. Let's focus on the critical thinking part and see how critical thinking is connected to everything else, and how does that relate to what we do in class, so we can enforce it and nurture it further. So if we go and do a sort of backward planning, so from critical thinking, if we take, one has to be principled, one has to be a thinker, one has to be reflective. So there are always multiple directions, and then if someone is, if we are focusing on the principled aspect of critical thinking, for example, checking for biases and making sure we account for different perspectives. So that's where we talk about things like perspectives. And in IB, it in a classroom, it becomes very relevant when we are doing analysis of paintings, because a lot of time students, it's very difficult to get the students beyond a very subjective statement that I like it or I don't like it.
Sir, Ms. Bhagyajyoti is asking that is it possible to give one example of it, since I'm new to IBDP, it will be helpful to understand.
Yes, that's I'll try and give as many examples from my own classroom, but the point is that I'm giving examples only because I am speaking, and I'm sure that everyone else is also doing this in their classroom. So, for example, I was just coming to it in IBDP, for example. When you talk about perspectives and developing critical thinking, I think the best place is comparative study, where the student takes up two artworks from different time and space and then draws comparison between their formal and stylistic elements and their cultural influences on both of them, and what does that say about these individual artworks and about art in general. So, and when I was saying that it was very difficult for the students to go beyond the subjective the reaction to a painting, which is I like it, I find it beautiful, and if you ask them to tell us why do you think, then I feel that there is sometimes a lot of resistance. So I do this kind of activity to develop critical thinking, that I ask the students to choose a painting to analyze, and then they have to justify why this painting is important enough to that the class will discuss this painting. That's the first question they have to ask, answer.
Can I ask something?
Yes, ma'am, for sure.
Uh, I just wanted to know, um, where do you fit in where they are thinking about the artwork? Because critical thinking is not only about history, right? It is also about the practice of art
Sure, ma'am.
when they are making art. So
Thank you so much
where
for bringing this up, ma'am. And this highlights the interconnected nature of different components in art, because the what we sort of introduce this as comparative study, but this is not the only way. The equal amount of analysis has to go into process journal and process portfolios also. So,
my question actually, if I can just elaborate, my
sure,
question is
ma'am.
basically is the balance between words and images. One is the process of creation, and another is evidencing or justifying it through words, right?
Yes, ma'am.
So, what is, I mean, I'm curious because I find the balancing quite difficult sometimes.
Sure, ma'am.
And sometimes it seems that words take over
Yes.
because it is evidencing. So, how do you strike a balance? At some point of time, if you can discuss that.
Ma'am, I can address that right now. The only thing is that I can only contribute my own perspective to this, which is not definitely not so, should not be taken as its face value. But I think with my experience, there is a general thinking that the more you cram a slide with words, the more smarter the student comes off, or the more sincere the student comes off. But with my interaction with IB examiners, and I used to work with one a couple of years ago, and talking to other examiners, I have realized that that is kind of like a myth, not really necessary, because in my experience, we miss out a lot of opportunity in communicating our critical thinking in the visual aids we use. For example, if we use the arrow in the right time, right place, and point to a specific thing when we are writing about it. So a lot of it comes down to actually applying the visual language understanding into preparing your process portfolio or your comparative study. For example, using Venn diagrams in the right place, or making tables, or making these kind of illustrations. Or I usually, another thing that I tell my students to do is have these analytical sketches when they talk about formal elements, that this is the flow of attention in this painting, and probably have do it once overlapping and once in isolation, and then make connection between the movement and the meaning making. So a lot of it can be done without words. It's just, I think, but then which I am saying it as if using too many words is bad. It is not, because IB does not, in my opinion, does not distinguish between like the word number of words on each slide. They talk about, they only look for evidences of the assessment objectives, knowledge and understanding. So is there, so for example, I would rather say that if the language should be proper and academic rather than personal, but that's the only criteria. How much you write, a student writes, or how much doesn't write, is only judged by how well they have been able to illustrate their thinking into their process journal, and how well they have been able to establish their thought process, whether they do it by writing in words, whether they do it by arranging certain drawings next to each other and make it self-evident in by the way they place their work on a prep sheet, on a slide. So that's my perspective, and I'm sure that some DC sir would like to disagree with a lot of what I said, because DC sir likes to really be very rigorous with the academic language and the research process, and because and I think that's because of the difference in the training we both have had.
Yes, Ms. Shubha is also responding the same thing. I think maybe there is a maybe here the role of appropriate vocabulary is important. I mean, she's also
Yes, ma'am.
pointing out the same thing. Yeah.
Yes, ma'am. So rather than using too many words, the credit goes to someone who uses the right word at the right time, I think. So if one not mixing up things like portrait and painting, and so these subtle differences reflect a student's academic understanding. So I think, in my personal opinion, to be short, ma'am, long answer short, is that it doesn't really matter. What matters is if the evidence comes through to a objective reader, like if a third person outside from the class who's not a teacher or a student can read and make sense very effectively. I think it's a good process journal, process portfolio.
In fact, I also feel that, in fact, instead of making it too wordy, I mean, obviously, sometimes there are no other option just to express yourself through paragraph writing and things. But what I feel much more interesting and visually engaging is doing a mind map or creating a diagrammatic kind of scientific diagrammatic kind of drawing, Venn diagram. These are quite interesting, and with just keywords, we can just connect an entire painting or can share our own thoughts.
And I think a lot of the element also is on the students' thinking process and learning process. Exactly. Because I think in the same group of three people, one time I had students who were so they were like polar opposites of each other. One would only use words and photographs and movements in the different version of images to show his decision making. And one would really write down the reason why, the intention and the plan first, and then go and execute those. So how it shapes up should depend on students' inherent learning methodology and its negotiation with the teacher's teaching sort of style. I hope that helps, ma'am, because I think I spoke more than I knew.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
So the whole idea of this slide was to point out these multi-level, multi-dimensional connections and how to, I am just speaking from my experience, how to not be baffled by it, but try and make stories, use it as a story generator. That if, okay, for example, if I know my students, my batch needs more of theoretical understanding towards things, then I'll probably push them towards the more written word or more thinking, more discussions. And if I think that they need to jump into action, then I would try and put together a unit that that creates a story where the student feels that they need to take rigorous action for sustained period of time. So it's about that kind of subtle meta narrative to a unit plan that can be easily structured using these kind of tools. And so another aspect of visual arts beyond the per se subject boundaries is how it sits with IDUs and how it is connected with TOK, which I think is bone of contention for a lot of us. Me, it has been the IDU part more than TOK, but yes, I've seen the lot. So I thought that if we could share, I've written my, just like before the session, I went in 5 minutes and acted as a participant and added my first impression of each one of these. But if there's any other thing you can think of that you do in class and that goes with any of these aims, you can please mention it in the chat section, and we can also have discussion here about these, because I think we should spend time on this aspect before we move on to completely beyond curriculum again and discuss the implications of visual art and the skills we can inculcate in visual art in students' personal life and the world outside. So, for example, the first aim is enjoy a lifelong engagement, which in my mind it connects with experimenting and exploring things. So I would like to connect it with the experimentation done in sciences and draw connection between what are the similarities and differences between the way of generating knowledge by experimenting in arts and the way of generating new knowledge by way of experimenting in sciences. So,
sir, Ms. Shubha is again asking that with the overwhelming world of visual arts, the engagement in research can be daunting. How do you make it age appropriate? Do you take up art skills and break those into some kind of MIP format aligning with particular criteria?
this is, can you repeat the first part of the question?
Yes, it's with the overwhelming world of visual arts, engagement in research can be daunting. How do you make it age appropriate?
Ma'am, I can give you an example here. We were doing the topic with a unit titled, for example, Arts Through Time. And the idea was to establish how art changes or stays the same through time. Now, and we wanted to do it with MYP1, and we faced the same problem because it sounded very fancy and dandy in theory, but how do you even begin the conversation regarding something so vast and general like this with a group that's only been discussing basic elements of art? So instead of starting with ideas like art changes through time or anything like that, we grounded into something solid that students could produce. So me and DC sir came up with the idea of masks. How masks have changed through time and cultures and served different purposes in time and space. So from obviously in the current time, a lot of students, the first connection they made was because of the pandemic, the medical mask. But as the conversation went further, they even talked about masks that were used by hackers called the anonymous mask. And then from there, someone pointed out African masks. And from there, we went into the chronology of it, that folk art, and then different, how art also serves different purpose, from being really ritualistic religious ceremonies to healing and therapy purposes to personal self-expression. So the idea is to always ground the concepts into something concrete. So the ideas are like a cloud, but the moment you put them into an activity, they kind of become more structured and easier to deal with. And another thing that does is that kind of narrows down the scope of the student. Then the student does not have to make too many choices, or the teacher also has to do not make constantly choices. And they've kind of planned out a story how the unit is going to unfold through time. So I think this probably with an exception of DP2, this kind of strategy invariably helps where you start with a concept, but you gradually focus it to a very concrete product, and usually that's where grasps come to help. This is the essay task that we plan, and one good way of doing that, ma'am, would be starting the unit by designing the grasp and then reverse planning your unit. So once you have your grasp ready, you have the standards, the required task to be achieved, and then from there you can map out the content, map out the skills, and everything else. I hope that helps, ma'am.
Yes, she is
Thank
responding.
you very much. Yeah, it's very, very well expressed.
Thank you, ma'am. So if we move forward, and if there are, I'm not sure if how many of us teach exclusively MIP, or some of us teach DP also. So, but we decided to discuss TOK anyway, because I think the students in MIP also we do the preliminary practices for the same. So, uh, for example, if you talk about develop perceptual and analytical skills, how we do it in class is by doing still life studies, by doing observational studies for the perceptual part, and for in a formal analysis part. And analytical analysis we do when we are writing reflections for our own artworks, or we are doing analysis for another masterpiece. So if we can bring home the point, if we can that where we use observation in that analysis, and how we deduce things by using logic, by making those observations about the personal context, about the cultural context of an artwork. So that serves very well for students while dealing with their TOK. I help. Now, this one thing that I have experienced in my experience is that if we establish TOK in our subjects well enough, I think the TOK teachers will not have the tough time they have in delivering the basic concepts of TOK. Because in real life, most of the time the students hear the word like metacognition is in TOK. But I think there are so many times even the younger student, MIP students, have opportunity to start being introduced to things like metacognition, which is thinking about thinking. So especially when you are critically observing or analyzing an artwork, the student can be made aware that you are emotionally reacting to an artwork in a particular way because your personal context comes into play. That very act pointing that out counts as metacognition. Now the student is started to become more self-aware about what are the influences at play when he thinks he likes something or she thinks she likes something. It is because of certain influences. So these kind of making connection, if they are, instead of coming at an abrupt point for the sake of an assessment, instead of, if these concepts and are interwoven into the conversations we are having in the class, I think they work much better, because then students don't make a word or a task out of it. They can in the real time see that, okay, if I do this, I will be better off, because I will have been will be more capable in in my personal context if I do this. So there will be a sense of purpose and meaning in the task that the student will do. And that will also, going back to the question of research, ma'am, that grounding the student in their personal context helps them develop their perspective, understand other people's perspective, and also gives them a very good direction about the direction in which they would like to research things. So then you don't have to make those decisions. The student has the intuition for those decisions. That, sir, I will study kinetic sculpture, or I will study 14th century Japanese brush paintings because that's what inspired Van Gogh, and I love Van Gogh. When the student starts talking like that, I think a lot of our work is done. Then we need to just make sure that, okay, they don't get distracted or start getting too busy with their preteen things. So that brings us, we have kind of covered the skills, how they're connected within the curriculum, outside the subject. Now, if we were to loop back to what we were saying, the initial skills, so, and try and answer that question again now. So what do you think that we do in class that can help students deal with the specific situations they are going through in the current times? By the way, like, for example, a lot of people said critical thinking. But in my opinion, there's one more thing that become very important is management of emotions. I have been not observing that during the last 1 year, and I think this is going to continue, because it's not going to return to normalcy immediately as we start coming to physical school. Any child who had some sort of psychological pressure, their kink, their pressure just got exaggerated because of having to stay in isolation, or staying with or without family for a prolonged period of time, not being able to go out. So, and I think people who did participate in art in that time found a relief, and some people, it inspired some other people to take up arts as well. So that's what I have noticed in my personal context, is that art really, one students could see the differences. And art, although in curriculum things become very deadline oriented, and especially with as the children grow up, but I think art still provides a lot of opportunity to just sit down and discuss with students, that how are they feeling, especially when they are drawing and they're constantly saying this, I don't know what to draw, I cannot think of any idea. So that I use that opportunity to just make them close their eyes, take a deep breath, and take an account of their inner state. And that observation just has a positive impact. So is there anything that you would like to input here from what you have, your experience of switching drastically to online learning has been, and how certain practices have helped you and your students to cope with the real life in these situations? Please feel free to share it now.
Yes, Ms. Bhagyajyoti is responding that many learners who were not interested in art earlier, they also did artwork during the pandemic.
So we see more engagement with art in pandemic. because students are able to in real time make connection between the what they are doing and how is it affecting them. More engagement with art. So I think that goes for mostly management of emotions.
Yes, there is another response. Three collective consensus of society believes management of emotion is relevant only in early childhood. Indeed, a very good point of its significance in IBDP. Yeah.
Sir, can you repeat the first part where they were very useful
He is
words?
actually telling that I mean the management of emotion. People only think that it's relevant to early childhood, but I mean it's a good example where you connect it with the IBDP students also.
Yes, ma'am. And ma'am, I personally believe that IBDP students need more help than anyone else. Poor thing, there's so many of them start reading existentialism because they don't know which end is up. They have so many assignments, so many deadlines, and such rigorous inquiry into so many different directions. So I think sometimes I tip my hat to these children who at such young age partake in something so drastic. But yes, ma'am, and I felt that emotional management is important for teachers also, especially in last 1 or 2 years, because all our patterns we had for relaxation suddenly were broken. The little interactions we would have with each other while passing in the corridor or sitting next to the coffee machine, so those things went away. So
Yeah,
I
Miss
think.
Vardu is also responding social, physical, and emotional balance.
And how that is related to what we do in visual art is when we take account of our personal and cultural context. So when when we kick off the process journal, that's a very good opportunity in the process journal and process portfolio, where we can make students see the larger picture of how they society and their personal well-being is interconnected and how they influence each other because of the shared beliefs and personal how shared belief influence the personal beliefs.
Miss Vardu has raised her hand.
Yes,
I
ma'am.
think she.
Mr. Haninder, just wanted to share with the participants how I see your lessons from a side and why it has been such a great connection that was built amongst you and your students. It's just from there that I have taken social, physical, and emotional balance, that quite often you do not really look into the strict framework of a lesson being there, but you are more focusing on ensuring their emotional balance, that they understand the society around them, that they connect themselves with the society. And also you keep them physically happy. I mean, you never tell them to sit in front of the desk and stay there until the end of the lesson. Something that would be a common thing to see everywhere. But this is what I have observed and learned from your own teaching approaches, that this balance and actually the difficulty that the students usually have in the diploma program, they do not experience the same in your class. And for me, this why was answered with this balance that you have in your class. Just sharing my observation. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for pointing it out, ma'am, because that kind of goes to the core of my practices in class, is that everything branches out from the knower. This is where knowing TOK framework also has helped me. I've realized that just very few basic conversations between the students' personal visions, their personal sense of how they would like to see themselves develop as an artist, and then try and connect them with the curriculum exactly the same way we are doing in this session, kind of puts things in perspective for the student, where they are able to see their own personal story, their own personal reflection into the curriculum. And that's when you just have to keep tuning their harmony, that how are they feeling and what they must deliver. And so that actually solves a lot of questions and confusion in chaotic times, because whenever student feels mentally blocked or creatively blocked, they can always go back to that story and see themselves as that archetype or that vision that they're creating in their mind. So here in the next slide,
Okay, Ms.
this
Shubha is asking, do you get entire class for MVP 4 and 5 in visual arts?
ma'am, DC sir, we are, since we are becoming in the process of becoming a complete IB continuum. DC sir takes MIP 4, and I haven't taught MIP 4 or 5 yet, but I will take up MIP 4 next year, and DC sir will move on to MIP 5. But what we try and do is we try and since a couple of years we've been trying to get the students to submit the process general and have a e-submission on the lines of the final e-submission for
No,
their
she's
MIP.
yeah, yes, ma'am. They actually it's actually optional, not optional. I mean, the student who select the subject, they only came for the visual arts in 9th and 10th.
Okay, I think I misunderstood the question. Yes, ma'am, it's an optional
Yeah.
subject in MIP.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm just thinking about numbers, and I'm also thinking about guidance. So that's why I was inquisitive to know whether you have like an entire class where students may or may not be interested. Because by MYP 4 and 5, students have their preferences. And so I wanted to know, the interest level. If it is a mandatory class, then you approach the students in a way. If it is a selective group of students, then you approach the class in another way. So that is what
Absolutely,
I
ma'am.
wanted to find out.
Yes, ma'am. We have students choose visual arts. So we have students who have been interested in art beyond like MYP 3. But at the same time, I totally understand the point you're making, ma'am, because it's not that we have not faced that problem with MYP 1, 2, or 3, or in PA in as well. We have been actively working on this aspect, that if first of all, it's, I don't think it's fair for everyone to expect every student be equally excited and engaged with art. But this is where I think doing these exercises have come to my help, where I try and get into the students this thing personal context and see if I can make some connection between what we are doing. For example, I have had students who are very interested in sciences or product design. So I would only I will focus and try and interpret the assignment in design terms with them. If there's someone interested in animation, I try and interpret the task in terms of a narrative for them. So when you have a lot of students and with different varying skill levels and varying level of interest, I think the best thing, most useful tool is differentiation. How you make your classes so flexible and malleable that someone with advanced skill level also feels engaged, and someone who just wants to do the activity and go home peacefully, and some probably not even that without an encouragement, can also deliver and acquire basic concepts and deliver the basic evidences for understanding. So basically be able to get 4 or 5 or a 6 hopefully with some effort if they feel inspired enough. So but that is definitely, ma'am, is a it's a monumental task, because when it automatically means when you have all the students, the groups are also larger, and you have to deal with so many different perspectives. So I think a lot of it boils down to the mental agility of a teacher, and I understand that it is very taxing. But then again, I think the more fluid we make our conversation and organic we make our conversation in the class, the more things sort out themselves, because once the student gets their ear open, their brain will automatically start making the connection, and they will interpret this task in a way that excites them. But they have to be made safe making that choice, because a lot of times students walk into a classroom with an expectation that the teacher will give me precise instructions. I'll do them or not do them, that's what for me to decide. Or but the teacher is supposed to tell me what to do. So
In
the
this
more
context, Ms. Shubha is again asking a very interesting question. If you can share what are the most used tools of differentiation that you use thinking of a unit plan
ma'am, first thing is
and strategies, yeah.
I try and create tasks that are not unnecessarily material specific. Let's say medium specific. Unless I'm trying to teach them tones, and my point is to do make them think in a very basic grayscale version. I will not tell them that use black and white pencil or use colors or use paints. So the task is usually the task sounds like create an image using word. And then students start throwing questions at me. Can I use a pen? Yes. Can I use a digital drawing tool? Yes. Can I don't feel like anything. Can I just do it directly with a pen on the notebook I have? Yes, for sure. So the more the student feels that they can make decisions, so those kind of opportunities. And I think the best one is there with the choose letting them choose their medium and material so that they have the opportunity to grow their skill levels in the areas they are interested in. And also give, for example, another task that we have lined up is illustrating poems. So for that, I could very easily go to a library and find very respected and literary poems, but I rather chose to have a conversation with the students whether they like poems or not, and half of them said no. Then the conversation went to which kind of words do you like. Some people said we like dialogues, we like reading screenplays. Some people said we like songs, lyrics. So we kind of expanded the limits of our task to not illustrate just the poems, but words. Those words could be a small part of a prose, it could be a haiku, it could be a dialogue, famous dialogue from a movie, or or it could be some lines from the songs they like, lyrics of songs. So the more flexibility you code into program into your tasks, the more differentiation will be possible, and the more students will feel engaged. And that's, I think, how one can engage a larger group, not all of whom are like by default excited or inspired to create art or engage with it in meaningful way. I hope that helped.
Yes,
Is so
thank you.
Yes, ma'am. So, just to bring home certain points that see we are living in a time where we have had the growth of our technical innovation has been going like this for 5,000 years, 10,000 years we were like this, and now we are going like this. If you map out actually the invented technologies every year that we use now, you'll see a graph like this. To a point, people are now arguing whether we are approaching a singularity, which I think is its same way of saying that we'll build a Tower of Babel which will reach heaven. I think it will be a bell curve. But the point is that the scientific model of universe is so complicated we cannot use it. We use a jingle to explain it. We need complex set of moving images to even try and comprehend some of these ideas. And we have such a bombardment of information and news during society, multiple perspective which sound equally convincing to you. So you have these very conflicting set of narratives being very confidently told to you, and you must decide which one is the more truer one, or where is the actual truth. So I think this current situation is so much dependent on the visual information, how we think about who we are, how we think how we are related, our relationship is with the larger community. And you might have heard a lot of stories about this also. Countries have realized that wars are expensive, so there are a lot of covert effort to culturally subvert a culture from outside, to start planting ideas there. And so to be aware of these things, to be able to navigate into this mess of mesh, I'm sorry, of information that seems endless, I think these skills that we discussed, critical thinking, metacognition, navigating different perspectives, they can be very easily and in a very fun way be inculcated in students by talking about silly drawings and why is it something seems funny and why doesn't, or why is it something pretty and why doesn't. So that's another, going back to how do you break down these complex things into something age specific, is that we try and find a metaphor or a microcosm of these factors at interplay in students' personal life. So to answer the question why art, like if I had to answer, like I'll just go through a slideshow for 5 minutes and then we can end the session. So after this point, I think the why art is important for development of student outside the curriculum is because we can see from real life examples how art, and more specifically how images, visual art, images change the world, and how images in themselves are so powerful. Because these days whole wars or attacks on a country are programmed thinking of what kind of image it will create. If you remember, there were calls leaked from this incident, the attack on Mumbai's Taj Hotel, where the mastermind was instructing that put the cots on fire near the windows so the press can see the fire coming out of the windows. So it's like orchestrating, creating an image in a very terrible way. So they have very strong image, and then these images get burnt in a psyche. This is an image of Hiroshima, and the power of images is such. One can say that okay, this is just a photograph taken. The bomb, the actual killing of the people affected people's thoughts and their view beliefs. But I would try and make a different case wherein I think a lot of people would agree that if Vietnam's war wasn't documented in images so well, probably we would not have seen such a strong uprising in America against war. And after this, they actually changed laws in US, and now there are more restriction on how war can be photographed and published. So probably we don't. That's probably why we don't see so much footage coming out of Afghanistan and Iraq. And this is an example I think most of you would be aware, where the idea was people were planning a war or proposing to plan a war in UN, but this painting was hanging over them. So people felt very uncomfortable planning the war with while this painting was there. So they had the curtains pulled over the painting. So as so many people would tell how their life changed when they saw this sculpture for the first time, and it means so much to so many people. And this is one of my favorite images. I'm sorry if I'm taking too long, but this is Earth shot by Voyager in 1990, which is now gone out of a solar system and is probably is definitely the furthest any man-made object has been has traveled. It's just crossed the started to cross the outer layer of solar system. But this the Carl Sagan, the famous astrophysicist, the called this dot the pale blue dot. I'm sure that a lot of it's a very famous image. I'm sorry if I'm just telling you what you already know, but I think to consider that all our issues, all our humanity, our history, the glorious past, the monuments, everything has come out of this dot, and probably will never leave this dot, and will even transient on the dot itself. I think that's quite humbling, just to put this image in perspective. And it kind of changes the way we think who we are. And I think most children also and most of us would agree that it brings us joy and peace. So with this, I conclude the session. And I hope you found it a little useful and at least in part thought provoking. I would love to hear your responses and reflections about the same in the chat section. And if you have any suggestion about what kind of session we can have next in the visual art sort of stream of sessions, please feel free to do that. As it is our first session, we did a very general session, but I think if depending upon what interests kind of interests are shown, we would like to do take specific aspects as well and discuss them at length. For example, process journals or comparative study, or uh, just connection with TOK or connection with CAS or connection with service and action. So I hope you found it useful again. I thank you, and I give the stage back to DC sir. And if there's anything any question, please you
Yes,
can ask.
there is one question over here. At what level do you introduce time-based art as resource or practice? How do you use photography as tool to be recorded or artistic medium?
Ma'am, I, for example, for especially after after the shift to online classes, a lot of my assignment have naturally gravitated towards photography because of the availability of camera with everyone. Most students have a camera in their hand than they have paints in the house. So, but the time-based arts in MYP 1, 2, and 3, I only discuss with the students who actively show interest in it. For example, we have a couple of students in MIP 4 and MIP 3 who do a lot of animation. So I allow them to respond with their animations, and I try and give them packets of tips and resources as and when possible. But in a more structured way, we deal with time-based arts and serial narratives and these kind of like larger formats in IGCSE 9, which is MIP 4 now in after the continuum.
Okay, I think there is no more question. Mr. Sayed has written over here that it would be nice if we have a competitive study and process journal webinar or discussion like this. Definitely, we would love to have a session on that in upcoming days. Yes, competitive study and process portfolio. Uh, right, and the reflections are coming on. So let's just wind up the session today, and probably with some we can arrange some much more focused, subject-oriented, topic-specific webinar in future.
Yes, and I'm looking forward to this also because it will provide us an opportunity to really focus our lenses on one aspect and really comprehensively discuss it. And so I think we will most likely head towards that direction, bring things more focused and more sort of clearly defined with coming sessions and in between, but I would say there's some merit and value in discussing things in general terms as well. So probably we'll continue with some of those as well.
Yes, Ms. Bhagyajyoti is also asking, I think it's a wonderful session. The specific session can be taken on MYP, IBDP, CAS and TOK. Ma'am, CAS and TOK sessions are already going on in general, CAS and TOK, but CAS and TOK session related to visual arts that can be arranged in upcoming days. Yeah.
Yes, I think that will also be a very fruitful session if there could be a TOK and CAS connection with IBDP visual arts.
Yeah.
We can discuss that specifically. And it will help us with planning and many other things as well. In fact, I like to make the case that visual art teachers are one of the best suited teachers for TOK. But I think that's just my bias.
Don't make other people angry.
This is sir is telling me to speak for myself, which I respect. So I think if the session, we can conclude the session if there is no questions.
Yes, there is no more question as of now. Is there any feedback form for the next session? Ms. Shubha is writing.
Ma'am, we were hoping that you would write your reflections in the chat section and we'll pick it from there.
Didn't
hope-
realize. Okay,
Okay, ma'am.
sorry. Yeah.
No, for sure, ma'am. We try to keep it as like simple for the people who are joining in this time without making them click on many links and type in many things. But I feel encouraged also, ma'am, and I feel very grateful that you people took out time to show this, and I think it gave us a lot of lot of confidence in terms of our practices and lot of time to think and reflect on them also at the same time. And I hope you felt the same to a certain extent. Vardui, ma'am, would you like to say anything before we conclude the session?
Well, actually, I wanted to say thank you very much for this different format of session, because usually they take a different way of looking into the areas, more imposing their own perspective rather than opening a platform for everyone to think and share. And when we spoke about the good practices, I really felt the practices are being shared, and it allows us to come up with new ideas, try them in the classroom. Thank you very much. And thank you, participants. Thanks a lot for this open discussion, for being really active to share your views, because we actually need to find other ways of communicating with each other, be that internationally, be in India, because usually the workshops do allow us to get a lot of theoretical information to know the standards much better. But when it comes how these standards go into the classroom and how they are practiced, these are the missing points that we can later on enhance through this kind of open communication. Thanks a lot, and we really hope that we would be seeing you a lot more times in the future. Thank you.
So, okay, yeah, well, the reflections are coming on, yeah. So let's just wind up the session today. Thank you everyone for coming, and thank you, Mr. Haninder, for this beautiful session.
You're welcome, sir.
Yeah, so I'm just winding this up.
Yes, sir.